Hello everyone, my name is Andrew. Today we continue learning Python, and today we'll talk about the biggest mistake in Python programming language. So let's start. It's not really the biggest mistake because there are many errors, issues that can arise in your program, but really that mistake is very popular, and it's almost it's almost like the biggest mistake with the beginners in Python and beginners in programming, because they don't know what they are doing, and for some part they don't know what they are doing, and they need to fix that mistake as fast as possible. So what do I mean by that? Each mistake, so every mistake, can be crucial for the application. However, there are some mistakes that can show themselves a little bit later, and there are some mistakes that you should avoid at any cost. So let's look at the code here. The mistake that I'm gonna discuss today is how I call it, when you use too much of Python's potential. So what is that code? We have class called SumClass. We create an object from that SumClass, and then we're saying that if object dot class, that is the variable of the class of our object, dot name, so the name of the class of our object equals SumClass, then print object is SumClass. So what does it basically do is that it compares the name of our object to the SumClass, and if object is the object of SumClass class, then object is SumClass is getting printed, or else something else. Let me just write it, else print I don't know, no, something like that. So let's run our code, and let me just check that nothing is, yeah, we don't have anything else, so it won't interrupt our experiment. So object is SumClass. You may say that, oh, all right, everything is great. So yeah, everything is great because we received the real result, so the result that we wanted to receive. Object is SumClass, so yeah, that is very great. However, that code is not the best. It's actually the worst code that you can ever write when you comparing types. So why is that? Because, as I said, when you use too much of Python's potential, you may end up hurting your project. So Python allows you to get the name of your class from your object, the name in a string. And for some people it may be a very great addition to the language, but for others it may create those mistakes. So what is the mistake here? First of all, what if we change the name of our class? So SumClass2, for example. Let's run it. Oops, it says no. But actually it should say yes. Why is that? Because we are comparing types here. We are comparing one type to another. And what we need to do is manually change SumClass to SumClass2. And only after that we are saying that object is SumClass. However, that is not the only problem. The problem is that you need to do that in every part of your code, in every part of your project, when you are using those object.class.name. And that is one of the errors. The second error is that you can't check for the children of that class. So if I have, I know, something like class B that inherits from SumClass2, then I can't check for that. Of course, you may not need to check for that, but there are far greater problems when you're using that approach. And why is that? Because Python allows you to do that. Other languages, you can do it in other languages, but it would be really hard. And yeah, Python just allows you to do that, but never write that code. Why is that? Because it's not the best way to do it. First of all, you have function is instance that does it like, yeah, you should just use that function if you want to compare types. So SumClass2, and if I rename it, it's a normal variable, so yeah, SumClass renames to SumClass2. So refactor works for every part of my project. If you don't want to use isInstance, you can use type, but isInstance is better. What I'm saying in that example is that you should never ever use all of the Python's potential just to replace some function, just to replace some code. So if you can't describe why you need to use, specifically why you need to use object.class.name or anything else, so if you can't really say, I need to use that part of my code to do that, then never use it. And that works with almost any technology, almost anything in IT. So for example, if you can't explain why you're using classes, then don't use classes. If you can't explain why you're using, I don't know, that if, why do you need that if, then don't use that if. It works with everything, and Python is not an exception, and those things are not exceptions either. And you should always remember that if you can't explain why specifically you're using object.class.name and you don't use other functions, other stuff, don't use the code that you was using in your project. And yeah, that is the first example. The second one goes with class some class 2. It's a very common example, and by the way, you may think, if you work with Python, you may think that, bro, who would ever write that if class name equals something? Well, actually, that is an instance from one of my projects, not mine projects, but I refactored that Django project, and someone really wrote that. So never do that. It's a very big error. The second error is almost as popular as division by zero, so or as popular as some other errors. It's a very popular error. That's what I'm trying to say, and that is setUtter. So setUtter is a function that allows you to set your values to, or set your keys to values using strings instead of dots. So basically what setUtter function does is object.b equals 20. So object.b equals 20. So as you can see, the first parameter of that function is an object, the second an object, any object. The second one is the name of your variable. In our case it's a b, but as you can see, we don't provide it as we provide it as like b variable here, but we provide it as a string here. And it may be very beneficial for you, because what you can do is actually set strings. So you can iterate through a list and set some strings to the value. So object b equals 20 is basically the same as setUtter. So the third argument is the value after the equals sign, so right operand. And yeah, kind of like that. But what is the problem with setUtter? As I said, it's a very popular and very powerful function, because a lot of people use it, and for some parts of our code we really need to use it. For example, if we're talking about descriptors, so I have a video on descriptors, and I used setUtter function in that video about descriptors. So it's a very popular and powerful function. However, a lot of people use it very badly. So what is that wrong usage? Here is an example. So what we have is some quest2, which has a variable as 0 in it. Let me just put 10 so we can see a different result, because we sum a and another variable b. What we're doing, so we have some quest2, a is 10, then we create object of that some quest2, and we use setUtter function to set up a new variable for our object, which is variable b with value 20. So print, what it does, it just sums up a and b. But you can already see that there is a little bit of a problem with b, because if I hover over my object.b statement, then I can see that unresolved attribute reference b for some class 2. So what does that mean? That means that PyCharm and any other, well, I'm sure some IDs, so some programs can identify that after that setUtter you have object.b, but a lot of IDs and a lot of programmers will not really realize that, okay, after you have setUtter, so after you created a new variable with setUtter, you can use it as a variable b. So yeah, it shows you that unresolved attribute reference b for some class 2, it may be an error, but if you run it, as you can see, 30 is the result, so everything works, but the code itself is not the best. Why is that? First of all, because you're using setUtter, your IDE can't really create a scheme for your some class 2. Why is that? Because you're using b, you can change it to n, to m, to a, b, c, d anytime. And the second problem is that why do you even use setUtter function? Because as I said, it's basically the same as object.b equals 20. So why not just use object.b equals 20? It is the same, however, your code is indexed now, so you can use your variables normally, and even if you rename your variable, so something like c for example, all the variables will be renamed. So it's much better to use that approach than to just using setutter for, I don't know why. Some people use setutter to avoid checks. So what I mean by that is that in some applications, in some libraries, modules, you have lots of checks. So for example, your object, your some class, imagine that some class is immutable. So we cannot change the value of some class. Immutable means like a constant object. I talked about that, and yeah, you should watch my video about immutable and mutable objects. However, let's imagine that some class is, or some class 2 in our case, is an immutable object. And what some people are trying to do is use setutter object, then use something like mutable and set it as true. You should never do that as well. Why that? Because Python, once again, allows you to use setutter in order to change your variables. However, first of all, what you can do is use object dot underscore mutable equals true. Second of all, what is the problem here is that you're using a protected variable out on the outer scope of your code, so you should never use underscore variables anywhere except for the classes those variables are in. So for example, if mutable is here, then of course I can change mutable to 10, for example. But I talked about that in one of my last videos, so I'm not gonna focus too much on that in here. And the third problem is that if you can't use object.mutable equal true, so for example, if you use it directly, object.mutable equal true, imagine that you have something like an error saying that some validation checks, or you can't set that object, so you have an error for some reason, then there is a big problem with using setutter. So I've seen that in Django and in Flask applications. So people are trying to change the inner state of an object without knowing all of its parts. Because what can happen? Imagine that you are changing the state of your database model. Then the database model may not run some checks. Because you not run some checks because of some variable which was changed by you. So you should not, for example, you should not change mutable variable. You changed it and some checks were not ran. Because of that, your database was corrupted. Something happened with your data, or something happened with your application, and that is very important because Python allows you to do basically anything. What you can do is actually use private variable, for example a equals 20, and then you can get that private variable with some class 2a. It's not a problem, as you can see 30, but you should never do that. So Python allows you to do a lot of things. But what I'm trying to say with that video is that if you can't explain exactly why you're using that approach, and you can't just use anything else, which is far more normal, for example saying get a and then return self a like that, then you should never use your fancy code, because for each exception is not as exceptional as it seems. Something like that is in Python Zen, so you can read it, and yeah, each exception is not as exceptional as it seems. So whenever you're trying to use very fancy code that you would never use in other programming languages, try to explain why specifically are you using it. Because for a lot of reasons, for example meta classes, you can screw your project with meta classes, and I personally never use them. So I've never used meta class. Well, I've written some meta classes, but I've never used them in my life. And that is very important, because for 99% of the cases you can go with a very basic, very simple Python code, because that is what that language is for. Even if your project is a complex one, you can't go with a very simple and readable Python code. So what I'm trying to say is that if you're using something fancy needs explanation. That's all it is. Thank you for the watching. My name is Andrew. Subscribe to my channel, leave a like, leave a comment, and yeah, kind of like that. Check out my new course on the databases, and yeah, thank you and bye bye.